Greetings, class. In this brief video, I'm going to be talking about evaluating arguments. And particularly, I'm going to be talking about the use of using abstractions or substituting variables when determining if an argument is good or bad. And this relates to a quote by in Moral Reasoning by David Morrow. He explains beginners in critical thinking and argument evaluation sometimes evaluate arguments based on whether they agree or disagree with the conclusion. But this gets things backwards, since an argument can give you reasons to accept a claim that you didn't already believe. Evaluating an argument requires thinking about the premises and their connections to the conclusions. So I want to go over a technique that can help you do this and sort of detach from the particular conclusion and start to evaluate the premises. So to avoid this simply abstract from a particular conclusion and substitute a variable such as x. So we'll look at an example of a deductive argument given in the text Thinking Socratically. And the question asks, who in your opinion is the greatest musical artist or group of all times? Write a deductive argument to support your claim in which the premises logically imply the conclusion. So we're going to worry about the first part more. We're just going to borrow the second part. We're going to look at a deductive argument. We'll talk about that a bit more later. So in the, and one more thing. So for this, do not let anyone know. So think about what the greatest, you think the greatest musical artist is of all times. Do not let anyone know who you think the greatest musical artist is of all times. And instead of using the name of the artist or the group, simply substitute the name for the variable x. And so we're going to look at the an argument that the book gave. And it says, if the musical artist or group had the largest amount of commercial success, airplay, record sales, earnings, etc., then he, she, they were the greatest musical artists of all times. That's premise one. Premise two, it says the Beatles had the largest amount of commercial success. And then the conclusion, therefore the Beatles were the greatest musical artists of all times. Just fun, what's the name of this argument form? That's the deductive logical form of modus ponens. But what the initial quote is saying is some people might read this and say, oh, I like the Beatles. I actually think they're the greatest musical artists of all time. I agree. Or they might have the reverse action or inverse action and say, I don't like the Beatles. I don't think they're the greatest musical artists of all times. And so here you're simply agreeing or disagreeing with the conclusion and you're not evaluating the premises. And here we want to evaluate the premises. And so instead, what we want to do is simply save the premise, substitute x. X had the greatest amount of commercial success. Therefore, X is the greatest musical artist of all time. And this is an example of an argument put in a partial abstract form, right? Premise two, we're not saying any particular name of a group or a musical artist, an individual. We are saying instead an abstraction. And this turns our attention to the premise. And we start to evaluate the premise. And we say, well, is this a good premise for determining who is the greatest musical artist of all time, right? We further abstract it into y. So if the musical artist or group had y, then he, she, they are the greatest musical artists of all times. X has y, therefore X is the greatest musical artist of all times. But now that y is also a variable, we can ask, well, what is the best thing or criteria to substitute for y? And I'll give some examples, but this is not at all exhaustive. So some possible choices for premises when evaluating this premise or choices for y might include the greatest musical artist has the greatest commercial success. That's what we're going to look at. Influenced the most people, contributed the most originally to the art, has won the most awards, has produced the greatest song of all times, has been most successful upon the greatest amount of genres, interacts with their fan base the most. And this is just 7 criteria. There are many more. And there's also complications concerning, one second. Sorry. There's also complications concerning how to establish certain criteria. But now that we've given a possibility, a variety of possibilities for y, we can start to begin to critically think about the criteria for any individual premise that Y might be. So if we pick 2 has influenced the most people, we have to critically think and justify why that is a better criteria than all the other 6 criteria or other ones that you can think of. So this is an example of, instead of initially agreeing with the conclusion, to start to evaluate the premise. Turn this phone off completely. Okay. Evaluating the premise acceptability before agreeing with the conclusion. So this is sort of where we're at. By abstracting and substituting variables, we can evaluate the premises before we know whether or not we agree with the conclusion. So you thought of who you might think is the most, the greatest musical artist or group of all time. Instead of letting me know, just put an X or a Y, an X, and then start to look at the criteria, and then provide justification for this premise, this criteria, if we leave it in this one deductive form, and get the other individuals that you're trying to convince to either agree or disagree with the criteria. And only after they agree or they disagree with the criteria do we, then it's revealed who the artist, the greatest musical artist of all time is. Lastly, be sure to really abstract. Don't just abstract in form, but actually do it, right? So an example of someone that's not really abstracting. If the musical artist or group wrote the song Thriller, then he, she, they are the greatest musical artist of all time. X wrote the song Thriller, therefore X is the greatest musical artist of all time. All right, first, now we know who you're talking about. So, but second, you're just sort of pushing back the critical thinking. Maybe if X wrote the greatest song of all time, but then you have to argue that Thriller would be the greatest song of all time, and you have to argue criteria for establishing the greatest song of all time. So this is just a simple exercise and method for evaluating the premises instead of evaluating the conclusion. So I hope this helps, and let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.